Somewhere in the south of France, buried beneath centuries of stone and silence, may lie the remains of a woman who witnessed the most consequential events in human history. A woman who stood at the foot of the cross when most of Jesus' closest disciples had already fled. A woman who, according to all four Gospels, was the very first to see the risen Christ, and was then sent to tell the others. A woman whose story the Church spent nearly 1,400 years trying to erase, distort, and reduce to a cautionary tale of sin and repentance. Her name was Mary of Magdala, and if the ancient tradition of Provence is to be believed, she didn't die in the Holy Land. She came here, to France, and spent the last decades of her life in a cave on a mountain, in silence and prayer, waiting for death. Her skull, they say, still rests in a golden reliquary inside a Gothic basilica in a small Provençal town. Scientists who examined it concluded it belonged to a woman of the 1st century with dark brown hair, who was not native to southern France. This is the story of Mary Magdalene in France. It is a story woven from faith, history, legend, and mystery, and it raises questions that 2,000 years of Christianity have still not fully answered. First of all, thank you for choosing to spend these moments with me and religion as it is. In this channel, we'll discuss topics of all religions, always respecting everyone's faith and beliefs. If this topic interests you, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications to be alerted of all new videos posted. Thank you and enjoy. To understand why her presence in France matters, you first have to understand who Mary Magdalene actually was, and separate that from the image the Church promoted for over a millennium. Her name tells us something important. Magdalene most likely refers to her hometown, Magdala, a prosperous fishing town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. This was not a village of outcasts. Magdala had a significant Jewish population, a bustling harbor, and active trade. Archaeologists excavating the site have uncovered a 1st-century synagogue where Jesus himself may have preached. Mary was almost certainly a woman of means. The Gospel of Luke introduces her matter-of-factly in the 8th chapter, listing her among a group of women who traveled with Jesus and supported him out of their own resources. This detail is easy to overlook, but it's quietly remarkable. These were women of financial independence, funding a religious movement in 1st-century Judea. Mary is named first among them, a literary convention that typically signals importance. Luke also tells us that Jesus had cast 7 demons out of her. What that means exactly, whether it describes what we might today call mental illness, spiritual possession, or something else entirely, is impossible to say with certainty. What we do know is that the experience bound her to Jesus with a loyalty that would prove unshakable. When others ran, she stayed. When the male disciples scattered at the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene was there, watching. When the Sabbath ended, and it was time to tend to Jesus' body, she came to the tomb, and then something happened that would define her place in history. According to the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene was standing outside the empty tomb, weeping, when she heard a voice say her name. She turned and recognized the man standing before her. "Rabboni," she said, "Teacher." It was Jesus, risen from the dead. And he gave her a mission: go and tell the others. The early church called her the Apostle to the Apostles. She was the first witness to the resurrection, the foundational event of all Christianity. Without Mary Magdalene, the Easter story as we know it simply does not exist. So why did the church spend so many centuries trying to diminish her? In the year 591 AD, Pope Gregory the Great stood before his congregation in Rome and delivered a sermon that would shape the image of Mary Magdalene for the next 14 centuries. He declared, without any scriptural foundation, that Mary Magdalene, the unnamed sinful woman who washed Jesus' feet with her tears in Luke 7, and Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, were all the same person. One composite character, a repentant prostitute. It was a theological decision with profound consequences. By merging Mary Magdalene with a sinful woman, the Church effectively neutralized her authority. A former prostitute could be venerated as an example of God's mercy, but she could not be a leader, a teacher, or someone whose testimony carried weight. As one scholar put it bluntly, by turning her into a prostitute, she is not as important. It diminishes her. The Eastern Orthodox Church never accepted this conflation. Neither did Protestantism when it later split from Rome. And in 1969, nearly 14 centuries after Gregory's sermon, the Catholic Church quietly admitted the error. The three women were not the same person. Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute. There was never any evidence that she was. But by then, the damage was embedded deep in art, literature, and popular imagination. From Renaissance paintings to Hollywood films, the image of Mary Magdalene as a fallen woman had become almost impossible to dislodge. Meanwhile, in the limestone mountains of Provence, a very different story had been told for nearly 2,000 years. The year is approximately 40 to 45 AD. Jerusalem is dangerous. The execution of Jesus has not brought the calm the authorities hoped for. His followers are multiplying. Herod Agrippa I, who had reclaimed the throne of Jerusalem in 41 AD, is moving against the new sect. James, one of Jesus' closest disciples, has already been executed. Others are imprisoned, beaten, or threatened. Into this atmosphere of fear and persecution, a group of people make a desperate decision. They are going to leave. The Provençal tradition, as it has been called for centuries, describes what happened next in stark and vivid terms. A group of Jesus' companions were seized by their persecutors and placed in a boat. Accounts vary on the details. Some say they were cast adrift deliberately, others that they set sail under the guidance of Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy man who had donated his own tomb for Jesus' burial. What nearly every version agrees on is this: the boat had no oars, no sails, and no supplies. It was a death sentence disguised as exile. Among those on board, the tradition names Mary Magdalene and her children Martha and Lazarus, the same man the Gospel of John describes as being raised from the dead by Jesus. There was Maximinus, one of the 72 disciples Jesus had sent out to preach. There was Mary Salome, believed to be the mother of the apostles James and John. There was Mary Jacobée, said to be a sister of the Virgin Mary. And there was Sarah the Egyptian, a dark-skinned servant whose story would eventually make this tiny seaside town one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in all of France. Joseph of Arimathea is a figure of particular fascination in this story. The Gospels describe him as a rich man, a secret disciple of Jesus, a member of the powerful Sanhedrin, who had nonetheless refused to consent to Jesus' condemnation. He had personally gone to Pilate to request Jesus' body, had wrapped it in fine linen, and laid it in his own tomb. After the resurrection, the authorities would have had every reason to want him gone. Cardinal Caesar Baronius, the renowned Vatican historian of the 16th century, recorded the tradition of the boat voyage in his ecclesiastical annals, noting that the party set sail from the shores of Palestine and eventually arrived at Marseilles in southern France. Not all traditions place Joseph on the same boat. Some accounts suggest he organized the voyage from the outside, providing the vessel or ensuring safe passage. Others have him traveling alongside the group to Gaul before continuing northward, all the way to Britain, where he is said to have established the first Christian church at Glastonbury. That story is a whole other mystery. What concerns us here is what happened in France. Guided, believers would say miraculously, by the winds and the Mediterranean currents, the boat eventually reached the coast of what the Romans called Gaul. Specifically, it came ashore in the wild, marshy delta of the Rhône River, in a region now known as the Camargue, a flat, wind-swept landscape of salt lagoons, flamingos, and white horses that feels like the edge of the earth. The place where they landed is today called Saint Mary de la Mer. The name itself, the Holy Marys of the Sea, tells the story. When the exhausted passengers stepped onto the shore, the tradition says they knelt on the beach and prayed, and a spring of fresh water burst from the ground where they touched it. They built a small chapel and dedicated it to the Virgin Mary. Two of the older women, Mary Salome and Mary Jacobe, were too frail to travel further. They stayed behind, tended by Sarah, and were buried in that chapel. Today, the church that stands on that spot in Saint Mary de la Mer still holds what are said to be their relics, in a wooden boat suspended high above the altar. Every year in late May, tens of thousands of Romani people, who have adopted Sarah as their patron saint, gather here for a festival that is part pilgrimage, part celebration, part cultural homecoming. They carry the statue of Sarah down to the sea and wade in with it, reaching the water. It is one of the most extraordinary gatherings in Europe, and it has been happening for centuries. But Mary Magdalene did not stay on the beach. Before we follow Mary further into Provence, it's worth pausing to ask a question that skeptics always raise. Why would the companions of Jesus end up in southern France, of all places? Is this just pious legend? A medieval invention designed to give France a prestigious Christian heritage? The historical context is actually more plausible than it might first appear. By the 1st century AD, the Mediterranean was a well-traveled sea. Jewish communities had been established in southern Gaul for generations, particularly in Marseille, which had significant Jewish and Greek populations. Trade routes connected the Levant to the ports of Gaul routinely. A group of Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Judea would not have found it impossible, or even unusual, to make their way to southern France by sea. There is also the matter of Jewish presence in the Camargue region itself. Medieval sources and some modern scholars have noted that Provence had an unusually active and established Jewish community in the early centuries of the Common Era. The region the tradition describes was not unknown, alien territory. It was a place with cultural and commercial ties to the Eastern Mediterranean world. None of this proves the tradition is historically accurate, but it does mean we cannot simply dismiss it as fantasy. Something brought early Christianity to Provence with unusual speed and intensity. The question of what exactly that something was remains genuinely open. After landing at Saint Mary de la Mer, the group separated. Lazarus and some of the others made their way to Marseille, where tradition holds that Lazarus became the city's first bishop, a role the Church of Marseille still acknowledges in its historical memory. Martha, Mary's beloved sister, is said to have traveled to the town of Tarascon, where she is credited with taming a terrifying river monster called the Tarasque, a story that, while clearly symbolic, speaks to Martha's reputation as a woman of extraordinary power and courage. She is buried there, and her church still stands. Mary Magdalene took a different path. She moved inland through Provence, preaching. The tradition describes Mary as an evangelist of remarkable effectiveness. She traveled the region with Maximinus as her companion and protector, converting people to the faith of Jesus with a directness and authority that the tradition clearly admires. She is said to have preached in Marseille, where she encountered the local governor and his wife, performing a miracle that converted the entire city. Whether or not we take such stories literally, they tell us something important about how the people of Provence remembered Mary Magdalene, not as a penitent sinner, not as a passive figure, but as a preacher, a teacher, someone with a message and the nerve to deliver it. For a period, she was the most active Christian missionary in southern France, the Apostle of Provence, as she came to be called, in addition to her earlier title of Apostle to the Apostles. But something was shifting inside her. The woman who had known Jesus personally, who had stood at the foot of the cross, who had seen the empty tomb and heard her name spoken by a voice she recognized, that woman was carrying something no words could fully express. The public life of preaching and persuasion began to feel inadequate to the depth of what she had experienced. She withdrew from the world. About 30 miles east of Marseille, rising abruptly from the Provençal plain, there is a limestone massif that stretches for 12 kilometers and dates back over 250 million years. The locals call it the Saint Baume, the Holy Cave. The name comes from the old Provençal word baumeau, meaning grotto, high up in the cliff face, accessible only by a steep climb through an ancient forest that has been protected for centuries, first by Celtic and Roman ritual, later by Christian reverence. There is a cave. It faces northwest, away from the Mediterranean sun, so it is almost always cool and shadowed. Water drips constantly from the ceiling into pools on the floor. It is a place of profound, almost overwhelming silence. This is where Mary Magdalene spent the last 30 years of her life. According to the Provençal tradition, she chose this cave as her hermitage, her place of total withdrawal from the world. She ate nothing. She drank only what dripped from the stone, and 7 times a day, she was lifted by angels into the sky, where she received spiritual nourishment directly from heaven. It sounds like poetry, and perhaps it is, but the cave itself is real, and the tradition of pilgrimage to it is older than any document that describes it. Christianity in Provence developed around this cave as one of its central sacred sites from the earliest centuries. The pilgrimage to Saint-Baume is documented going back at least to the 5th century, meaning that within 400 years of Mary's supposed residence there, people were already climbing that mountain to honor her. Among those who made the journey were kings of France. Francis I, who made the pilgrimage in the 16th century, Anne of Austria, Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, who walked the path the tradition calls the Chemin des Rois, the King's Road, to reach the cave. Today, the cave has been transformed into a chapel. Dominican friars have been its guardians since 1295. Inside, carved into the living rock, there is an altar, pews, and a life-size statue of Mary Magdalene being carried to the heavens by angels. Hundreds of pilgrims climb to it every day, their footsteps worn into the ancient stone of the path below. The silence inside the cave, interrupted only by the sound of dripping water, is the kind that reaches into the chest and stays there. Somewhere between 60 and 63 AD, the tradition is not precise, Mary Magdalene knew that her time was near. She descended from the cave for the last time. She made her way to the small Gallo-Roman town the Romans called Villa Lata or Tegulata, a place that would later take the name of Maximinus, the disciple who had been her companion and protector throughout her years in Provence. Maximinus had become the Bishop of Aix-en-Provence, and it was to him that Mary came at the end. He administered the last rites to her. She died in his arms. Maximinus had her body placed in an alabaster sarcophagus and buried in an oratory he had built in the town. He himself was later buried nearby. So were Sidonius and Marcel, 2 others from the original boat. The town that grew up around their graves became Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, and it remains, to this day, one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in France. Indeed, the people of Provence have long considered it the 3rd holiest site in all of Christendom, after Jerusalem and Rome. For centuries, the tomb of Mary Magdalene sat quietly beneath the small church of Saint-Maximin. Then came the Saracen invasions of the 8th century, when Christian communities across Provence lived in terror of destruction and desecration. In 710 AD, someone, we do not know who, but someone clearly acting out of protective devotion, secretly moved Mary's remains in the middle of the night. They transferred her bones into the marble sarcophagus of Sidonius and placed inside the lid a wooden tablet sealed in wax. Then they hid everything and said nothing. The tomb disappeared from living memory. For over 500 years, the location of Mary Magdalene's remains was lost. Other sites claimed her relics, most notably Vézelay in Burgundy, which attracted enormous numbers of pilgrims throughout the Middle Ages, based on the claim that monks had secretly transported her bones there for safety during the Saracen raids. For centuries, Vézelay was one of the most important pilgrimage churches in all of Europe. Then, in 1279, something happened that would shift the balance entirely. Charles II, the Count of Provence and later King of Naples, nephew of King St. Louis of France, had become obsessed with finding the true burial place of Mary Magdalene. He had consulted ancient chronicles and local records. And then, the tradition says, Mary Magdalene appeared to him in a dream and told him where to look. He ordered excavations beneath the old church of Saint-Maximin. And deep in the earth, they found it, a marble sarcophagus. When Charles approached the tomb and touched it, witnesses reported that an extraordinary fragrance filled the air, sweet and floral, utterly inexplicable in a buried crypt. Inside the sarcophagus lay a complete skeleton, minus the lower jaw, with hair still surrounding the skull. And in the dust at the bottom of the tomb, carefully preserved in wax, was the wooden tablet inscribed with words in Latin. It read, "Here lies the body of Mary Magdalene." Attached was a parchment explaining the 710 AD transfer, that the remains had been secretly hidden during the night to protect them from the Saracens. Charles II immediately wrote to Pope Boniface VIII in Rome. The Pope, astonishing everyone, revealed that the Lateran Basilica in Rome had long possessed a jawbone venerated as belonging to Mary Magdalene. When it was brought to Saint-Maximin and placed against the skull, it fit perfectly. In 1295, the Pope published 6 official documents establishing the Dominican friars as guardians of the relics and officially recognizing the church at Saint-Maximin as the true burial site of Mary Magdalene. Construction began on a massive Gothic basilica, which still stands today, one of the finest examples of Gothic architecture in southern France, to house her remains. Whether you believe in the supernatural elements of this story or not, the physical fact is undeniable. In 1279, excavations in Saint-Maximin uncovered 1st-century tombs and a marble sarcophagus containing remains that had clearly been venerated as those of Mary Magdalene for a very long time, and those remains have been there ever since. Today, if you descend into the crypt beneath the Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, you will find yourself in a cool, dimly lit space where 4 marble sarcophagi from the 4th century line the walls. At the far end, housed in an extraordinary golden reliquary wreathed in sculpted hair, is a blackened skull. Its eye sockets stare outward. A piece of forehead skin is preserved separately nearby, what the Church calls the noli me tangere, Latin for "do not touch me," the words Jesus spoke to Mary at the tomb. Tradition holds that this is the patch of skin where the risen Christ touched her face in that Easter morning garden. The skull has been described by scholars as one of the most precious relics in all of Christendom, and one of the most famous sets of human remains in the world. In 1974, French scientists from the CNRS, the National Center for Scientific Research, were given permission to examine the bones housed in Saint-Maximin. Their conclusions were careful and deliberately limited. They could not confirm that the remains belonged to Mary Magdalene specifically, but they could say that the bones were consistent with a woman who lived in the 1st century AD, who died at approximately 50 years of age, and who had dark brown hair. They could also say something else. The woman whose skull this was not originally from southern France. Her physical characteristics suggested origins in the eastern Mediterranean, the Holy Land, or somewhere nearby. More recently, in a study published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, an interdisciplinary team of researchers, including specialists in forensic anthropology and facial reconstruction, used the skull to create what is believed to be the first scientifically based portrait of what Mary Magdalene may have looked like. Working from 360-degree photographic mapping of the skull's surface, combined with analysis of the hair relics, they reconstructed a face, a woman with high cheekbones, dark eyes, and an expression that the researchers described as both serene and formidable. The skull has remained sealed in its glass case since 1974. There has been no DNA analysis. The technology exists. The Church has not granted permission. The mystery, for now, remains intact. Every year, on the Sunday closest to July 22nd, the feast day of Mary Magdalene, the skull is brought out of the crypt. A golden face mask is affixed to the reliquary. 8 men, with 8 more standing by to relieve them, carry the 400-kilogram golden reliquary through the streets of Saint-Maximin on their shoulders. Pilgrims line the streets. Candles are lit. Songs are sung in the old Provençal language. People have been doing this for hundreds of years. Kings and queens have walked this same procession route. Ordinary men and women have wept here. The faithful and the curious and the merely bewildered have all stood in that crypt and looked at that skull and tried to understand what they were looking at. Is it really her? Nobody alive can say for certain. And yet the weight of the tradition, the depth of the devotion, the persistence across 20 centuries of people climbing that mountain to that cave and descending to that crypt, all of it speaks to something that cannot be entirely dismissed as invention. Mary Magdalene has never quite stayed in the box that history tried to put her in. For the past century, and especially in the last few decades, she has resurfaced with an intensity that suggests something unresolved, some account that still needs settling. The Gnostic Gospels, discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, describe a Mary Magdalene who is almost unrecognizable from the penitent sinner of Western tradition. In the Gospel of Philip, a text from the 2nd or 3rd century, she is called the koinonos of Jesus, a Greek word that can mean companion, associate, or partner. The text says Jesus loved her more than all the other disciples and would kiss her often, provoking the jealousy of Peter and the male apostles. In the Gospel of Mary, she alone receives secret teachings from Jesus that the male disciples are not given, and Peter's resentment toward her is barely concealed. These texts are not part of the canonical Bible. They are later Gnostic writings, not eyewitness accounts. But they tell us something important. Within the very early Christian world, there were communities of believers who understood Mary Magdalene as the closest, most trusted, most spiritually advanced of Jesus' followers. Not a footnote, but the central figure after Jesus himself. The canonical Gospels themselves, if read without the centuries of accumulated interpretation, support a remarkable conclusion. Mary Magdalene is the only person mentioned by all 4 Gospels as having witnessed both the crucifixion and the resurrection. She was there at the beginning of the end, and there at the beginning of everything that followed. No other apostle can claim that. In recent decades, scholars, theologians, and popular writers have revisited her story with fresh eyes. The 2003 novel The Da Vinci Code brought the most sensational version of her story to a global audience. The idea that she was Jesus' wife, that she carried his child to France, that a royal bloodline runs through European history. Most serious historians reject these claims. The canonical Gospels offer no evidence of a romantic relationship, and historians of early Christianity are deeply skeptical. But beneath the sensation, a genuine question persists. What was the true nature of Mary Magdalene's relationship with Jesus? Why was she the first witness to the resurrection? Why did the early church feel so threatened by her memory that it spent centuries attempting to reduce her to a prostitute? And why, despite all that, did the people of Provence never stop climbing that mountain? There is something that happens when you stand in the cave of Saint Baume that is difficult to put into words. The dripping water, the cool air against your skin, the absolute silence, broken occasionally by the murmured prayers of a pilgrim kneeling at the altar inside the cliff face. You are inside a mountain, inside a story that is 2,000 years old, and you cannot quite decide where history ends and legend begins. That ambiguity is, perhaps, exactly the point. The story of Mary Magdalene in France is not a story that resolves neatly into fact or fiction. It lives in the space between, in the persistence of devotion, in the tears of the Romani people wading into the sea at Saint Mary de la Mer, in the worn stones of the path to the cave, in the golden skull carried through the streets of a Provençal town by 8 men straining under its weight. 2,000 years after a woman named Mary of Magdala stood weeping outside an empty tomb and heard her name spoken by a voice she recognized, people are still coming to this corner of southern France to find her. Maybe that, more than any relic or excavated sarcophagus or scientific analysis, is the most extraordinary thing of all. The places associated with the Provençal tradition of Mary Magdalene are still very much alive and accessible to anyone willing to make the journey. Saint Mary de la Mer, in the Camargue wetlands of southern France, is where the tradition says the boat landed, The fortified Romanesque church at its center dates back to the 9th century and still houses the relics of Mary Jacobée and Mary Salome in a wooden boat chapel above the nave. The crypt below holds the shrine of Sarah, the Black Madonna, patron saint of the Romani people. Every May, the town is overwhelmed by one of the most vivid, joyful, and deeply moving pilgrimages in Europe. The cave of Saint Baume, in the Var region east of Marseille, is accessible by a steep 45-minute climb through one of the most ancient protected forests in France. The Dominicans, who have guarded the site since 1295, still hold daily mass inside the cave. The silence at the entrance, where you are asked to enter without speaking, prepares you for something that is difficult to describe and impossible to forget. The Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, in the town of the same name, is where Mary Magdalene's skull rests in its golden reliquary. The crypt beneath the basilica, where the marble sarcophagus still stands, is open to visitors. The skull can be seen in its glass case. Standing in front of it, looking at those ancient eye sockets, at the dark hair preserved in the reliquary, you feel the full weight of a story that refuses to end. And then there is Vézelay, far to the north in Burgundy, which also claims her relics and which was for centuries the dominant pilgrimage site in France. The Abbey of Vézelay, dedicated to Mary Magdalene, is one of the great Romanesque buildings in Europe. Its crypt still holds some of her supposed bones. Pilgrims still come. Bernard of Clairvaux launched the Second Crusade from Vézelay. Thomas Becket took refuge here. The light inside the nave on the summer solstice falls through the windows in a line of perfect circles across the floor, a phenomenon so precise it seems almost impossible. Whether by design or miracle, nobody has quite agreed. These are the places. The story is older than any of them. Mary Magdalene stood at the cross. She stood at the empty tomb. She carried the news of the resurrection. And if the ancient, stubborn, 2,000-year-old tradition of Provence is to be believed, she came here, to France, to the wild edge of the Roman world. And she stayed until the very end. The cave is still there. The water still drips. The silence still holds. And people are still climbing the mountain to find her.